long before the first American flag ever waved. Giant cities rose, vanished, and were forgotten. Empires ruled these lands, long before Columbus set sail. But history buried them. Now, we're digging up the truth they never taught you in school. Who really discovered America? And at what cost? Long before America had borders, before there was even a whisper of independence or freedom, this land pulsed with life. Towering earth mounds rose in the Mississippi Valley, built by a civilization so advanced they engineered cities aligned with the stars. In the Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans carved entire towns into cliffs, surviving in harmony with brutal deserts for centuries. From the Great Plains to the Pacific Northwest, indigenous nations flourished, with governments, trade routes, languages, and deep spiritual roots connecting them to the land. This wasn't an empty wilderness. It was a living, breathing continent, rich with culture, law, and legacy. But history would paint it differently. Then came sails on the horizon. Europe was entering its age of discovery. But for the people of this land, it would become the age of destruction. Who truly discovered America? Some say it was Leif Erikson, a Norse explorer who touched these shores centuries before Columbus. Others say you can't discover a land already home to millions. But the myth of discovery stuck. And in 1492, when Christopher Columbus landed in the Caribbean, the door was kicked wide open, not just to exploration, but conquest. The Spanish followed, chasing gold and empire. The French came seeking fur and trade. The British arrived craving control. They brought steel, guns, and disease. Entire native communities vanished in months. Ancient cultures erased overnight. This was the beginning of a collision, not just of worlds, but of ideologies, of dreams, of survival. And in the chaos, the seeds of a new power were being planted. But they wouldn't grow peacefully. They would rise through blood, betrayal, and revolution. By the early 1600s, the European grip was tightening. On the banks of a river in Virginia, Jamestown rose, the first permanent English settlement. Further north, in a cold, unforgiving wilderness, the Pilgrims stepped off the Mayflower at Plymouth, praying for religious freedom. But freedom, even then, came at a price, and not for everyone. As colonists carved out their new world, they turned to enslaved Africans to build it. Ships crossed the Atlantic in chains. Families torn apart. Lives sold for profit. Slavery became the backbone of the economy, its shadow stretching across the land. Indigenous tribes were pushed further west. Forests were cleared, rivers redirected, treaties broken. The land was being remade, but not by nature, by force. The 13 British colonies grew richer, tobacco, cotton trade. But the mother country wanted more. England taxed tea, paper, and nearly every transaction, all without giving the colonists a voice. No taxation without representation. It started as a slogan, but it lit a fire. Tensions boiled over in Boston, where crates of British tea were hurled into the harbor under moonlight. At Lexington and Concord, muskets fired. Paul Revere rode through the dark, shouting warnings into the wind. These weren't isolated protests. They were the first tremors of a revolution. And in 1776, with quill and ink, Thomas Jefferson wrote the words that would echo through centuries. We hold these truths to be self-evident. The Declaration of Independence wasn't just a document. It was a defiant scream to the most powerful empire on earth. We will be free. But freedom would not come easily. A ragtag army stood against the mighty British redcoats. Outnumbered, outgunned, underdogs. Yet in the mud, smoke, and chaos of war, a new nation began to breathe. The war raged for years, freezing winters, empty stomachs, and countless graves. But in 1783, against all odds, the colonies emerged victorious. The British surrendered, and from the ashes of revolution, the United States of America was born. In 1789, George Washington took the oath as the first president. The Constitution was still drying with ink. The Bill of Rights promised liberty and justice, but only for some. Women had no voice in politics. Millions of African Americans remained enslaved. And Native Americans? They were treated as obstacles, not citizens. This young republic was a contradiction, built on ideals of freedom, yet shackled by exclusion and inequality. Still, the nation expanded, fast and hungry. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the country overnight. President Thomas Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark to explore the uncharted wilderness. They crossed rivers, mountains, and tribal lands, chasing a dream that America was destined to stretch from sea to shining sea. They called it manifest destiny, the belief that it was America's divine right to conquer the continent. But destiny comes with a cost. With every mile gained, new tensions simmered. Free states versus slave states, North versus South, freedom versus ownership. The divide was growing, like a storm on the horizon, and soon that storm would break. By 1861, the United States was no longer united. 11 southern states seceded, forming the Confederacy. They fought to protect a way of life built on slavery, and the idea that states had the right to defy the federal government. In the North, President Abraham Lincoln had a different mission: to preserve the Union, and increasingly, to end the moral stain of slavery. What followed was the bloodiest conflict in American history. Brother turned against brother. Families torn in two. Fields that once grew crops became killing grounds. Gettysburg, Antietam, Bull Run, names now carved in stone, once soaked in blood. Over 600,000 lives lost. And yet, amid the carnage, change emerged. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that enslaved people in the Confederate States were free. It was more than a legal act. It was a turning point in the soul of the nation. 2 years later, in 1865, the Union triumphed. The Confederacy collapsed. Slavery, legally, was abolished, but the victory was bittersweet. Just days after the war ended, Lincoln was assassinated. The leader who held the country together was gone, and though the chains had been broken, the wounds were still open. Reconstruction began, a period of rebuilding, reuniting, and reckoning. But progress was met with resistance. Former slaves faced new forms of oppression through violence, laws, and the war was over, but the fight for justice had only just begun. After the Civil War, America didn't just recover, it exploded into motion. The Industrial Revolution turned farmland into factories. Smokestacks pierced the sky. Steam engines roared across iron rails, stitching the coasts together. And cities, once small and slow, grew tall, fast, and hungry. In New York and Chicago, skyscrapers rose like steel monuments to progress. Men like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan built empires, not with swords, but with oil, steel, and banks. They were hailed as visionaries and feared as monopolists. Meanwhile, across the ocean, millions were watching. Immigrants flooded in from Ireland, Italy, Poland, China. They came with nothing but hope, chasing the dream whispered across oceans. The American dream. Ellis Island became the gateway. Statue of Liberty, the symbol. But behind the promise was a different reality. They worked 14-hour days in choking factories. Children carried coal. Families crammed into filthy tenements. There was no safety net, just survival. While the rich bathed in gold, the poor drowned in soot. This was the Gilded Age, shiny on the outside, but rotting beneath. Labor strikes erupted. Union organizers risked everything. People demanded change. And as America flexed its industrial muscle, its gaze drifted beyond its borders, to islands in the Pacific, to shores in the Caribbean, to territories that could be claimed, ruled, and reshaped. The age of American imperialism was beginning. What started as a republic was becoming something else. By 1917, the world was on fire. In the trenches of Europe, World War I raged, a brutal, muddy nightmare of machine guns, gas, and chaos. And America, once distant, was pulled in. When the U.S. entered the war, it tipped the scales. Fresh troops, endless resources. The Allies triumphed, but the cost was unimaginable. When the guns fell silent, the map was redrawn. Old empires crumbled. New tensions sparked. But peace didn't last. Back home, the Roaring Twenties boomed, jazz, flappers, and Wall Street euphoria. But the party was built on sand. In 1929, the stock market crashed. Banks folded. Jobs vanished. Families lined up for bread as the Great Depression gripped the nation. Then came an even greater storm. In 1941, after the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, America plunged into World War II. Factories, once silent, roared back to life. Women took over assembly lines. Young men stormed beaches in Europe and jungles in the Pacific. It was total war and total transformation. In 1945, America dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing Japan's surrender. But it also unleashed a terrifying new age. Mushroom clouds rose. Millions cheered. But the world shuddered. America had won the war, but it came out changed. No longer just a nation, now a superpower. But the celebration didn't last long. A new enemy was rising, not across oceans, but across ideologies. The battlefield shifted from open war to silent tension. The Cold War had begun. America and the Soviet Union weren't firing bullets. They were playing a deadly game of chess. Nuclear weapons, spy games, proxy wars. One wrong move, and the world could burn. In Korea, American troops fought to stop communism spread. In Cuba, missiles brought the world to the edge of annihilation. And in Vietnam, the jungles turned red with a war no one could fully explain, and few believed in. Fear gripped the nation. Fallout shelters were built. Children practiced duck-and-cover drills, as if desks could protect them from nuclear fire. But even as America stared outward, a deeper battle was raging at home. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. Martin Luther King Jr. marched through the heart of the South. Crowds filled streets, voices rising in protest and prayer. They weren't just asking, they were demanding justice. The civil rights movement cracked open the myth of equality. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was signed. It was a legal victory, but racism, segregation, and inequality still festered. And then came the storms. The assassinations of MLK and Malcolm X. Protests on college campuses. Burning cities. Vietnam dissent. A generation caught between war abroad and injustice at home. At the same time, America was racing for the stars. In 1969, a grainy broadcast showed Neil Armstrong stepping onto the moon. One small step for man. It was a triumph, a symbol of human achievement. But back on Earth, the cracks were growing. The nation that reached the stars was still struggling to find peace with itself. As the 1980s dawned, America stood bold and brash. Ronald Reagan took office with promises of strength and revival. The economy surged. Wall Street roared. And behind closed doors, Cold War strategies escalated. The arms race accelerated. Billions spent on nuclear deterrence. But cracks were forming on the other side. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. By 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War, 4 decades of fear, ended with a whisper, not a bang. America stood alone, the sole superpower, victorious and unstoppable. Then came the digital revolution. Apple, Microsoft, the Internet. A new world was born, coded in ones and zeros. Information spread faster than thought. Silicon Valley became the new frontier. The American dream went online. But the 21st century would begin in horror. On September 11th, 2001, the unthinkable happened. 2 planes struck the Twin Towers. The Pentagon burned. Flight 93 fell in a Pennsylvania field. Nearly 3,000 lives lost in a single morning. The world watched in silence. And America, stunned, grieving, furious, changed overnight. The War on Terror began. Troops marched into Afghanistan. Later into Iraq. New enemies. New wars. But the questions grew louder. Why? How long? What cost? At home, fear tightened its grip. Surveillance expanded. Airports became fortresses. And a new era of political division took root. Hope, fear, patriotism, distrust. All surged together, reshaping the nation once more. America was still powerful, still influential, but now deeply uncertain. The dust of war never truly settled. As America entered the 2010s, it stood at a crossroads, powerful but conflicted, technologically unmatched, culturally dominant, yet boiling with division. The economy rebounded, but inequality widened. Wall Street soared while wages stagnated. Rural towns faded as tech cities thrived. Then, in streets across the nation, a cry rose again. Black Lives Matter. Police shootings ignited protests from Ferguson to Minneapolis. Millions marched, demanding justice, accountability, change. At the same time, the country fractured along political lines. Red versus blue. Left versus right. Truth versus conspiracy. Social media amplified every voice and every lie. Elections became battlegrounds. Misinformation spread like wildfire. The Capitol was stormed in broad daylight, a democracy shaken. Climate change worsened, fires, floods, and rising seas warning of a planet in peril. Immigration debates roared. Mass shootings haunted schools and churches. And yet, through the chaos, innovation surged. AI, space travel, renewable energy. New voices rose, younger, more diverse, more defiant. The American spirit still fought to define itself. It was no longer about left or right, but about the soul of the nation itself. Who are we? What do we stand for? And what comes next? America was no longer just a place on a map. It had become a mirror, reflecting its promises and its failures. From ancient mounds to moon landings, from revolution to reinvention, the story of America is one of bold ambition, painful contradictions, and relentless change. It is a nation that enslaved and later elected a black president, a country that welcomed millions and shut its doors to many, a superpower of unmatched influence, yet still battling its own identity. And today, America stands at a turning point once again. Technology reshapes how we live, work, and think. Artificial intelligence, deepfakes, and algorithms blur the line between fact and fiction. The truth itself is under siege. Democracy faces pressure. The climate grows unstable. Voices grow louder, angrier, but not always wiser. And yet, there is still hope. America is more than its government, more than its past. It is an idea, one still being tested, challenged, and rewritten every single day. Because history doesn't end. It evolves. So the real question is no longer, where has America been? It's, where does it go from here? If you found this journey through time as powerful as we did, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold stories that shaped our world. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an episode. And tell us in the comments, which moment in American history do you think changed everything? This isn't just history. It's the story of us all.